Come on this side.
Mr. Davis, I'm going to give a little announcement about the online stuff.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As always, the meeting is being live streamed on our county's YouTube channel. And in compliance with the Freedom of Information Act, notice of meetings and agendas were posted and furnished to all news media and persons requesting notification. And I'd also like to introduce our newest Greenbelt program's staff member, our Greenbelt specialist, Ina Dasso. She comes to us from the planning department. She's been doing site plan review over there most recently. She has a dual master's in environmental studies and public administration, and we're very happy to have her on board.
Welcome. Awesome. Welcome, Ina. Great to have you. Let's see. Moving on to the meeting notes from April 6th. Do I hear a motion for approval of those meeting minutes?
So moved.
Second. A motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries by unanimous vote. At this point in the meeting, we switch over to comments from the public, and it appears we have one member of the public who would like to speak, Mr. Willie Johnson.
Good morning.
Yeah, I'd like to speak about the activity of the Greenbelt property and also about the funds and what we can develop the property for. And I'm from the Willtown Community Center on Parker's Ferry, 5779 Parker's Ferry. Okay. And we have some Greenbelt property in the area, and we would like to know, what we can do with it, and are there any funds available for that use?
Sir, I'll be happy to, if you want to stick around for the meeting, I'll be happy to meet with you after the meeting and pull up your grant agreement.
Okay.
That's what governs what you can do on the property, and I just don't know that offhand. We'll have to pull that up and look at it, sir.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, our staff is, and Mr. Eric Davis is totally available to help you sort that out.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And I didn't have any other check marks for people wishing to speak. So is that everyone who would like to speak? Okay. Okay. Good. Thank you. At this point, I'm going to kick it over to Mr. Davis for a Greenbelt program update.
Thank you. In recent GAB meetings, the program updates have been fairly abbreviated because we haven't had much movement as far as new projects awarded or new funds being added to the pot. That has changed because council did approve the 9 projects that you all recommended to them for that winter cycle. And we've also received our information on our FY23 allocations. So I'm going to go into a little more detail than usual. And starting with program status, we now have 188 total Greenbelt projects that have been approved, 109 of those rural, 79 urban. And the breakdown between conservation, easements, fee simple, and minor improvements is 60, 121, and 7. The program's protected over 24,000 acres, the bulk of those being rural with over 22,000, and over 1,600 for urban, and of course conservation easements. The acreage there is more than double the acreage for fee simple, which is 6,831, and then 190 acres related to minor improvement projects. Total funds awarded, $127.6 million, $81 million to rural, $46.7 to urban, $29.9 for conservation easements, $97.1 for fee simple acquisitions, and just over $600,000 for minor improvements. So this was all accomplished at an average cost per acre of $5,232. And as we expect, urban cost per acre is always going to be higher than rural due to land values. And same with fee simple versus conservation easement, because you are purchasing the entire interest in the property and not just a portion. Match provided or funds leveraged from the Greenbelt Awards is $164.9 million, representing 129% match, with 336% match for conservation easements, 66% match fee simple, and just under 50% for minor improvements. And interestingly enough, rural and urban both now have provided 129% match for those projects. Public access, we have just under 11,000 total public access acres. That's about 42% of Greenbelt projects, with $141.7 million awarded, and that's 87% of the funding for public access. And as you know, we track minority lands, funding, and acreage based on the criteria, the extensive criteria in white there at the bottom of the slide. The county has committed $52.6 million to minority lands and 3,264 acres. All right, closing. So far in 2022, we've closed on one project. That's that's Pappy's Island 2. And we have been going back and forth with the project applicant for Deerhead Oak, and their due diligence is coming to a close, and they hope to set a closing date here in the next few weeks. And then we've got, of course, all the new projects that council just approved over there on the right-hand side, and that is, again, 9 projects that we're just getting started on, moving towards closing. Our Greenbelt goals update. Just as before, we've met half of our goals and exceeded those. That's national forests, wetlands, and county parks acreage. But we have not yet met rural lands, urban lands, or corridors goal. The biggest jump was in rural lands with all the properties that were added in the last grant cycle. That percentage jumped 3% up to 89% of the goal. I'll move into funding status unless there's questions. Okay. Total funds currently available. As a reminder, none of this is bonded or borrowed money. It's pay as you go, so that money is made available as it comes in and is collected. Our allocations actually increased more than we had originally anticipated for FY23. There's a total allocation for FY23 of $6.95 million for rural and $5.55 million for urban, leaving a balance available total just under $26 million, rural $18.8 million, and urban $7.1 million. This is our slide that shows the funds on hand for each municipality's allocation, and I'm happy to report, except for unincorporated, all of our municipalities are back on the positive side at this point. Any questions? Okay.
Hey, Eric.
Yes, sir.
Can I ask, would you mind going back to the one slide before the minority lands that showed public access? And I just want to make sure I'm clear. The total acres and then the total awarded. Can you just explain those just to me real quick? I hate to don't want to take up everybody's time.
So that's showing that of all the acreage in the Greenbelt program, that 10,959 acres have some degree of public access. And that those projects that are tagged as public access projects, that we've spent $141.7 million on those.
Okay. And that's 87% of the total award?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's what it means. Okay. One other question is the Isle of Palms or Sullivan's Island with the what kind of closing has to happen with that? Do they not own that?
They do. That's probably a misnomer saying it's a closing, but it's we haven't closed that project out yet. We haven't awarded them funding. So those minor improvement projects, we actually they incur the cost and then provide invoices to us to show that it's been paid. And once they've checked all of our boxes, then we reimburse them for those costs.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. And this is our slide showing urban funds remaining for the lifetime of the program. And that's going to be that column over there on the right-hand side. Total of 92 million still remaining. And you can see the breakdown there between the municipalities. And again, with the urban unincorporated, we're still at about 30% of those total lifetime allocation is remaining.
I had a quick question on that, on a particular slide. Now that the census 2020 is completed, will the number, is the program tied to the 2010, or will there be some point that the numbers will be
I just asked Kathy about that last week. And what I'm trying to do is to go back through some of the plan and the ordinances to see if if it spoke to actually updating that with the 2020 census. But for this round, I thought instead of changing it without knowing for sure, that's what we were supposed to do.
Yeah. No, I understand. I was just curious. Thank you.
And then the third item on our Greenbelt program update is the FY23 summer application cycle. I know at one time we had said we may try and avoid that as we're going through the 5-year plan, but we have had some eligible Greenbelt fund recipients reach out to us with some time sensitive and what looked like pretty good quality projects. And since we also have just started Ina, it would be great to have her go through a full grant cycle before Peggy retires next year. So we're going to go ahead. I think with the extra staff capacity, we'll be just fine to run this FY23 summer application cycle. And details on that, again, there's 18.8 million in rural, 7.1 million urban, 24.1 million total that'll be available, not just for the summer cycle, but both cycles in FY23. Schedule for the summer cycle, it will open on June 13th and close on July 29th with the anticipation of the subcommittee meeting in September to consider these projects, the GAB in October, and targeting Finance Committee and Council in November. And then there will also be a FY23 winter application cycle, and that will be your standard 3-month window that will be opened up from early November until late January. And the intent is for the summer to be an abbreviated cycle. It's open for about 6 weeks. Any projects that are not really buttoned up and ready to go that still have significant outstanding issues, we would recommend those be bumped to the winter cycle to give those folks more time to get their project applications together. And one thing that we want to do is to standardize the schedule, assuming all goes well in the next year, that we would have these same dates and these same cycles with the summer being a shorter one and the winter the full 3-month application period. And we're really, we did get some feedback from the survey and just outside of the survey that it would really help applicants if they can know further in advance when these cycles exactly will be, so that they can try and line up their other funding sources. So my intent is to stick with these 2 cycles year in and year out, assuming all goes well this year. Any questions on summer cycle?
How do we publish those in terms of social media? Do we put that out there just through Facebook, or what are our channels currently with regard to letting people know about these schedules?
Currently, social media is our only, Facebook is our only social media outlet. But then we do maintain an extensive notification email list that we send out. We do post those, we announce them in the Post and Courier. We actually buy an ad in there to announce the opening. We will be putting it on the Facebook page for sure, and then we update the website with all of that information as well.
How many followers do we have on Facebook?
I'm not sure.
Okay. That seems like an easy way to improve. I mean, an easy area to kind of cultivate, maybe is the better way to put it.
And we'll get a little bit more into public outreach and communication when we get into survey results.
Yeah, sounds
Yes,
good.
sir.
Sounds good. Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. So moving back into the Greenbelt Plan 5-year review, which is required by our ordinance to review the plan every 5 years and make any recommended changes to county council. And as you know, we did implement a partner feedback survey, and we asked partners, which we considered all past applicants. We sent the survey solicitation out to every email address that we had in the system. We asked them questions regarding their satisfaction with various components of the Greenbelt program. Just right off the bat, at least 80% of respondents were satisfied with all aspects that we asked questions about, so that's a good start. However, we definitely understand that the incremental and continuous improvement is something that we want to strive towards, so we will run through each question briefly. Not going to get hung up on the pie charts there, but again, largely most everybody was satisfied with the way things are going now. And then over on the left, where the bullet points are, I just want to note that these are summarized comments from those that completed the survey. So some of the feedback we got is that regular reminders to municipalities on what their balances are and when the application cycles will open up would help them to start thinking further in advance and getting their applications together in time. So we'll start doing that. We also got some feedback that a quarterly or 2 times a year newsletter might be helpful to go out, not just to remind folks of meetings and grant application cycles, but to also help tout accomplishments in the program when new parks open, when new funds are awarded, that type of thing. And then we had some feedback that said workshops for smaller organizations that may not be as familiar with the program would be good. And we certainly are working towards that. We're going to be coming back with a new plan for public outreach and marketing later on in the year that we'll present to you, but it'll incorporate all of these things. And we're always available to go out and meet with organizations that have questions and provide presentations. And we're going to go ahead and note that kind of front and center on our application page on the website. And then again, respondents also said that more advance notice of grant funding cycles would be very helpful, and we're already trying to implement some of this feedback, as you can see with our standardized grant application cycle schedule for next year.
Eric, how many people did you reach out to, and how many did you receive responses to?
I believe we had over 200 emails that it went out to, and we received 29 responses, so a little over 10%. Not great, not terrible, but about par for the course from my experience with public surveys. And this wasn't just opened up to the general public. It was targeted at those that were familiar with the program. And one thing that we asked too is that if you if you had experience receiving communications from the Greenbelt program, please provide feedback. But if you weren't involved with closings, then don't provide feedback on that question, just so that we're getting good information. Next, we asked about satisfaction with the actual application and application process. And the majority of the feedback we got here was that the actual application could be designed and make some changes made to make it more user-friendly and collect better, more detailed information for us and for you all to be able to consider projects. And then we also got a comment that felt like municipalities should have an abbreviated application or review. I believe the term rubber stamp was used. I don't necessarily concur with that, but just wanted to throw that out there. That was some feedback that we got.
Jason.
It was not Jason. Review and approval process. Feedback we got here was that reviewers should consider inherent differences between rural and urban applications. And I think the gist of that was that we talk a lot about bang for your buck, and urban projects are always going to be more expensive than rural projects. So I think they want us all to keep that in mind. And then also some good feedback was it would be helpful for applicants if we can provide them feedback to help improve their applications in the future. So perhaps sharing our staff scores with them and maybe just holding a phone call to say, here's where you lost points, here's where you might be able to pick up points next time. And we're happy to do that. Property monitoring. We got great feedback on the property monitoring. The only real suggestions were related to public access, and specifically to reach out to all of our applicants and just check in and see, those that haven't met their anticipated dates to open a project to the public, just to maintain a schedule and an update of when that might happen. As well as when we look at our conservation easement monitoring, some of those talk about limited public access. So just actually asking that question, was there any limited public access in the last year since we monitored the property? And if so, how many dates and what did that look like? So we can start tracking some of that. And then we asked just about overall impression of the program, and the feedback we got from, I believe, a City of Charleston employee. He noted that he was speaking as a City of Charleston resident, but that he felt that the program should be expanded, that we should identify additional funding for the program, as well as look at expanding different offerings within the program. And also we got some feedback, again, that we can improve our outreach to small landowners and smaller organizations that may not be as familiar with the program. Oh, yes, sir.
If you've just finished that part, can I just sort of make an observation? 200 emails sent out, 10% responded, that's 20, and 80% satisfied, that was 16, sort of not satisfied is 4. Not really a good sample to sort of draw any conclusions from. I mean, I won't dismiss those that sort of may be unhappy, but it's not exactly overwhelming.
Well, and I would note too that those that were not satisfied were not necessarily dissatisfied. We had satisfied, slightly satisfied, neutral, slightly dissatisfied, and then dissatisfied. So we got very little feedback that anyone was dissatisfied. And I'll be the first to admit this was not a very scientific survey, and we did have that targeted pool for respondents, and we went with what we had.
So on the strength of what you've done, I don't think we have any cause for concern.
Yeah, again, I think there's definitely some incremental improvements we can make based on the feedback, and most of it was stuff that we were already thinking about.
Fine.
Was there a clear difference in opinion between the urban folks and then the rural, or the partners that work the rural issues?
Not really. Some were able to chose to identify themselves and to identify their organizations, and I didn't pick up on any trends like that.
All right, we're going to move into the 5-year plan.
Yep. So next item is impervious surfaces, something that we've talked about the last several meetings. Just as a recap, we kind of started out by talking about some of the potential negative impacts of impervious surfaces on Greenbelt properties, as well as potential efficiencies that could be realized if there were a broad-based impervious surface limit on some properties. We then got feedback from Chuck Flink with Greenways Inc., who did a peer review of peer organizations to see what kind of impervious surface limits, if any, were they implementing in their jurisdictions. And I think what we drew from that was, yes, some are, but it may be difficult just to say all properties within this program are subject to the same limits or even included in those limits. We next provided kind of a starting point for how these caps might work, and just wanted to include this slide to remind everyone that generally, this is our original slide, that generally as a property gets larger, then the percentage cap should go down. And smaller properties typically have a larger percentage cap because that allows them to put in those minimum level of amenities like ADA parking, sidewalks, and restroom facilities. Then we refine that even more. And this is actually our staff recommendation, this slide, for impervious surface limits. There have been a couple of changes since you saw this the last time we discussed it. And those changes are, I felt it was best to pull out the active projects altogether from the impervious surface caps. And that would include projects that may have both passive and active together. And the reason for that is all the active projects are so unique, and we really have a small amount of those that have come through. So those could be addressed on an individual basis with a special condition. But as a reminder, these would apply to fee simple, non-active, non-corridor projects. And then one other change that was made to this recommendation since we last discussed is how we determine that parcel size. So that would be total acreage minus marsh minus open water features. And the reason for that, and we'll get into it just a little bit more on this next slide, I'll jump ahead. These were the projects that would be subject to the impervious surface limits that were just approved by County Council from the FY22 winter cycle. And I included this just to show that Legacy Live Oak Memorial Park, for example, is a total of 16.6 acres. But when you take out the marsh acreage, it goes down to 5.1 upland acres. So if you applied that 6%, which either 16.6 or 5.1 would fall into that category, if you're counting the entire property, they get a whole acre of impervious surfaces. But if you're really just looking at that portion where those impervious surfaces could actually go, then that drops down to about 0.3 of an acre. And you can see the similar scenarios down there for Sea Island Small Farmers Cooperative and Whooping Island Scenic Buffer as well.
Eric,
So now, yes, sir.
quick question. So would you consider like an active project, and I'm assuming you have the corridors there as well, like something like a greenway or something like that, where, the whole point is to have a impervious surface?
Yeah, those would be considered corridor projects, so those would not be subject to these caps. And actually our comprehensive Greenbelt plan defines active green space as play fields and parks with low environmental impact. And just for the counter to that, passive green space is defined as trails, greenways, interpretive parks, and access points for water activities. Of course, there's a little conflict between that and the corridor projects, but we're treating the Mount Pleasant Way projects as corridor projects and not passive green space.
Mr. Jones?
Maybe I should know the answer to this question, but when you do your calculation, are wetlands included in the total area, or you just do it on the non-wetlands?
So wetlands that would be up in the upland area, not a saltwater marsh or something like that, would be counted as part of the overall acreage. And the reason for that is wetlands, you get those delineated by the Army Corps, which can take quite a while, and it can be very expensive as well to get an approved jurisdictional determination. So I think that would actually deter folks from applying due to that cost and not knowing if they were going to get funded. And also those jurisdictional determinations sometimes are only good for 5 years, and that can change each time it is delineated.
And I can understand it, but I guess theoretically, it would be nice to exclude the wetlands in this calculation. I think in the Planning Commission, we've changed the delineation to only not including wetlands. So I think there's some precedent that recently.
Yeah, if we did include wetlands again, until the Army Corps agrees with you on that delineation, then it's just too hard to say what's considered wet and what's not.
Maybe this is all theoretical, but if we're using, you get a parcel of 25 acres, and if all of it is dry land and half of it is wetlands, you've still got the same impervious standard. Yes, does that seem right?
Could you repeat that?
If you've got, say, a 25-acre parcel, or two parcels, one's all upland, one's half wetlands, you've got the same standard for both of those. Is that right?
Under this recommendation, that's correct.
Elizabeth?
Well, in response to that, Eric, wouldn't we be able to still consider that on a case-by-case basis, even though it's not delineated? I think you can, at the site visit, you can kind of tell if it's a wet or dry, so to speak, and that could be a consideration in adjusting the recommendation. Would that not be true?
I agree with you. Again, these we would like to have some type of impervious surface limit, ensure that goes on each of these non-active, non-corridor fee simple projects. But just like someone may feel the need to have more impervious surfaces and make that case to the GAB and County Council, GAB could also say that we feel like that's too much because this is clearly wetlands, it's swamp, and then address that as a special condition as you have the ability to do now.
And just as a point of clarification, or maybe just to refresh my memory, this is all sort of addressed in the application process, right?
That's correct. So a lot of the issues we're having with impervious surfaces and stuff, this is one tool, but we're also really going to improve the front end of the application to get more details about the different types of buildings and structures and impervious surfaces and uses that are envisioned for a project. And we'll get that whole list so that anything that they may ever think they may want to do with the property, that you're all getting that information up front, and to determine whether that is a good use and that should go in the grant agreement as an allowable use as well. And then once you have that impervious surface limit in the grant agreement, if they come back and say, we want to switch this type of building to that type of building, or, kind of do some horse trading for impervious surfaces, that makes it a whole lot easier on staff and gives them flexibility. And then it doesn't have to go all the way through the GAB and County Council again.
Let me say that last part the way I heard you say it. So if they come back and want to trade, I don't know, some small bathroom for a roller coaster, let's say, you at the staff level can just kill that on the spot. It doesn't even have to come to us, right?
I would say a roller coaster would not be something that would go into their grant agreement, so it'd be clear.
Or just something that's just clearly not in the program.
We would look to that line that talks about uses for the park, and it says passive uses are this and limited to this, and
staff level.
Yeah, if we look at it and say, it's not allowed, we would say no. If it's clearly it doesn't meet any Greenbelt goals or definitions, we'd kill it at the staff level. If it's still something that could potentially be a Greenbelt and allow Greenbelt use, then it would have to go through the normal process of coming to the GAB for a grant agreement amendment and getting County Council's approval as well.
That sounds good to me. Yes.
I just wanted to add, I agree with not including wetlands, and just because of the timing factor and trying to sync that up with an application cycle. Just from experience, I know that the Army Corps, especially in the recent year or two, is extremely unpredictable about when you may get that determination back. It can take upwards of 6, 9 to 12 months just to get that line delineated. And I think that would really deter, as you mentioned, people doing these applications and the expenses incurred with it. And I think the idea of, going to a site visit and using some common sense and saying, if this is a swamp, no, you don't get to use that entire acreage. I think that makes a lot of sense. And just going through experience, I think that would be a very difficult additional thing to time up with all of the other things that need to be timed to go into our applications.
Thank you. Taylor, then Ray.
Just one quick question, I think. Did you look at conservation easements? Does it make sense to do this? I know in the agreements we normally talk about what they can build on those. Are you looking to apply some sort of formula on a conservation easement?
Well, we did look at conservation easements and how they typically handle impervious surfaces, and that's kind of what got us into the smaller parcels get a higher percentage, larger get lower. I don't think we would be as detailed in our grant agreement as a conservation easement would be, but certainly more detailed than what we are now in adding that stuff in.
Just to follow up to that, most of the conservation easements include that in them. And so when you're looking at the terms, we look at the terms of a conservation easement as part of the application. You can generally see what that expectation is. That's not only been a guide for us looking at what's the right number here, but that's the obligation of the holder of that easement to enforce that term over time. So it's there and enforceable by the qualified organization for those easements.
So, let me just ask, just so I'm clear. As I recall, when we look at these projects, the easements say, for example, they can build 2 houses or something like that. So who takes a look to see how much is it? When you get into the details, does it say, hey, the house can only be this amount of?
Depends on the
impervious
easement, because it depends on again, one by one, but usually you do have a total impervious surface, and many times you have an actual designation of a building area as well as the number of buildings. So it's incumbent upon that qualified organization to actually monitor that every year and account for that, or they can lose their nonprofit status if they don't do that.
How then do we know how much impervious surface are they going to be putting? Are they going to be allowing, and does it fall within these, if we adopted these guidelines, how do we know it falls in there?
I think it would create a burdensome administrative function to try and overlay our grant agreement terms with something that is with a conservation easement, just because it's duplicative. And it would inherently require a lot of time and communication just between staff on a monitoring and staff of the enforcing organization, the conservation group. And that is just excess burden that's unnecessary for the outcome. You've got guaranteed conservation on that. That's in the purview of the nonprofit. And that's what a successful partnership should do. You've got a common goal. It's meeting the goals of the Greenbelt, and you've got a partner organization that's required by law to enforce the terms of that easement. So we can count on that. And then if you have a problem, you can always discuss it.
Yeah, and two points there real quick. Our ordinance does note that the conservation easement takes precedent over the grant agreement for all of our conservation easement properties and puts the onus on the land trust to enforce that agreement. And then the other note is that all 3 conservation easements, I think it was 3 that were approved in the last cycle, did have impervious surface limits on there, building envelopes, and that's becoming much more common in the conservation easement world.
And do they meet these guidelines right here, or are they below the guidelines?
I don't have that info, but I would guess they're even more restrictive.
Anecdotally, just looking at easements, I know with these, they're a lot more restrictive.
And they get
Yes,
into subdivision
They actually
and
do.
buffers, wetland and waterfront and roadway buffers as well, which determines where buildings can go.
Let's go to Ray.
Probably two things, Mr. Chairman. I'm assuming that if we were to go the route of requiring wetland delineation, that would be a reimbursable cost out of the grant program, like we do everything else. And I know we have a concern about the administrative costs rising in all of these cases. So that's just a point to keep an eye on. And I guess the other.
Can you say that again, Ray?
It costs to get wetland delineation done. It's not free. I'm assuming that cost will be a reimbursable to the grant, like all the other administrative costs are. And I know the group was addressing some concerns over the last couple of meetings of how you've seen these administrative costs going up, and up to do these different things. So again, just this point that if we go that route, we expect more administrative costs to be added into the grant. So that was just a point in terms of that. And I guess the second thing, and just listening to the discussion, Eric, I guess it comes to you. How does the county, because most of the organization was a city or county, a site review process starts with the planning department. Is there something that triggers them to notify, or there's cross-pollination between the Greenbelt and either the cities or the counties if that piece of property is a Greenbelt project so something doesn't slide through the cracks?
That's correct. I'll let Peggy speak to that.
We have something called Intergov, and if somebody applies for a permit in the building department, we can set up an alert system that shows that that's a protected Greenbelt property, and they have to notify us.
Or even plat changes,
Planning.
code enforcement. Yeah, so those are all Greenbelt properties are flagged and you get notified.
Comment?
Well, just an observation, which perhaps you already know, but it came to light yesterday or the day before in a planning commission meeting. We have been advised, I suppose, as probably everybody else has, that the Army engineers are not delineating wetlands and whatever. They've now said they don't have the people to do it. Maybe I don't have it correct, but there is a change in what they can do, and that consultants now will have to be retained when delineation is necessary. Do you know about this?
Well, that's kind of been the MO for the last several years, is they've been so short-staffed, and development is so strong here that, if you want to get it done in any reasonable amount of time, even with a consultant, in my prior job, we were waiting 6 months to a year on a wetland delineation the consultant does it, submits it, and then the Army Corps reviews it and either agrees or requires changes.
Well, apparently there's a shortage of consultants. I'm not an expert. I'm just from what I've been told. So it's an issue. But the other question I have, these are not written in stone. These are recommendations, right? So we can look at these, and if maybe there's a lot of wetlands, we can change it. But this is not firm. It's just a recommendation, right, that goes before the applicants? Or you're saying they've got to conform to this?
Our recommendation is that in the application, it would ask about acreage, what's your total parcel size, minus marsh, minus open water bodies, and then it gives you your parcel size that would be plugged into this chart. And it would then tell you your parcel size is 1 acre, so you fall into the 6% cap. Your grant agreement's going to restrict you to 0.06 of an acre of impervious surfaces. Would you like to make the case for more or less than that?
Okay, so
there would be a state that would go into their grant agreement. Now, they would always have the opportunity to request a higher or lower limit, and you all would have the ability to recommend a higher or lower limit.
Okay, that's fine.
Yes, sir.
It just becomes a element of the application, really, if they want to go above.
Yes, sir.
And that's it. And then we can consider it, and that's kind of all there is to it, right? So in the interest of time, or Elizabeth, go ahead.
And I think
Yeah.
the benefit of that is it's achieving the goal of staff having something concrete to actually set as an expectation, and for the applicant to know clearly this is the actual number, and to think ahead if they want something different, as opposed to backing into it by accident, then having confusion on whether they can or can't. It's a clarity. And I think the benefit, as I understand it, is basically for the administration of that.
Well, that, and I think there is some benefit to in limiting impervious
Yes.
surfaces in general, as far as, we talked about runoff and flood mitigation and water contamination.
One more comment. It just seemed, I just would hate for the process to be harder on the small landowner or the organization that is cash strapped to like see their way through this. It'll be a very simple table in the application, right?
It will calculate for them.
Perfect. Okay.
Just
great.
like the match does now. They plug in their match, and when you get down to the scoring criteria, it says you've got this much match, you fall into this bracket, you get 6 points.
Okay. Fantastic. So, yes, Jason.
So for clarity, because I know that I was always taught that if I had a question, somebody else probably has the same question. Fee simple, active urban projects, right? Typically, we don't have a plan. We have in our mind, we know what we're buying that property for, right? Mm-hmm. So how does that fit into this whole thing? Especially the smaller parcels.
Active would be excluded.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Just under where it says proposed, and I know it's very small, but proposed standard impervious surface limits at the top of the slide, it's only for fee simple, non-active, non-corridor projects.
So
Okay. Okay. Well, in the interest of time, at some point, we should move towards a motion, but go ahead.
Yeah, just for clarification. Go ahead,
I
sorry.
wasn't finished.
Oh, sorry.
So it would be really good, I think, for all of us to see a case study, because we can talk about this stuff all we want until we see it, some kind of case study. I think that would be very helpful. So that, and I'm done.
Well, hold on, clarify that. So you would like additional information?
I think a case study for a certain piece of land, something in the past, something hypothetical.
I
So we
actually
can
have
all-
those. You may have missed the meeting when we produced those, but I'd be happy to
missed
dig.
one meeting.
Yeah, that must have been the one. I'll be happy to dig that up right now if you think that would be helpful.
I mean, I'll defer to everybody, but I'm not sure I'm prepared.
Well, go ahead, and then maybe we should dig it up if you can.
Okay, dig it up, but I think in terms of supporting what you're saying, Jason, one thing we can do, because I think we want to make some action on this, this is something I think that we learn by kind of testing it as we go. And I think, Jace, we've done a good job of trying to just test it on some of our projects to see what would it look like. And Eric has done that. And the other is going forward, maybe we review it every year. And that's part of what we do is say, hey, how did it look for the applications? And we can always adjust it. But this gives us a starting point for staff to have a tool and see how it how it works out for the applicants.
So these are the slides from, I believe, the February meeting when we gave some examples here. The first one being Full Faith Ministries Park on Johns Island. It's 9.68 acres, and this one actually already did have a special condition with a 10,000 square foot impervious surface limit that you all placed on that property. So that would equal about 2.4% of the property. Their acreage is 9.68 acres. So under what we're proposing, they would be allowed 0.58 acres, which is even lower than what we allowed with that special condition. I'm not gonna do the Edisto Youth Rec because it does have an active component to it, and our recommendation now is to pull projects with active components out. But the next one was the Jefferson Tract. It's 292 acres, and again, this one has, things have changed a little bit. It's got some large ponds on there, so these calculations aren't perfect. But including the ponds, they would be allowed 5 acres out of 292. Now that would go down once we took out the pond acreage. The next one's Wide Awake Park. It's 7.2 acres. So that would fall into the 6% tier. and would allow 0.43 acres of impervious surfaces. Right now, we've calculated that they have 0.33 acres of impervious surfaces on the property now. And this is that park. And those impervious surfaces consist of the structure and the concrete that are around it. So they would still have about 1/10 of an acre in impervious surfaces that they could add to the park. And then the last one's Pinckney Park. That's a town of James Island Park off of Fort Johnson Road. It's 7.37 acres. Again, falling into the 6% tier, they would be allowed 0.44 acres. They currently have about 0.07 acres of impervious surfaces, really just consisting of a restroom, building, picnic shelter, and maybe a sidewalk through there. So I hope that helps a little bit. If we need to tease that out more.
So at this point, in the interest of time, is there a motion to accept the recommendation of staff, or would y'all like to see something different? I can't motion. I don't believe that. But you're okay. And do we have a second?
Second it.
Okay, so the motion on the table is to accept the recommendation of staff. We have a second. Any other clarification needed there? Okay.
You can open for discussion.
Are we open for discussion? Yeah.
I just feel that this has been discussed with deference to you, sir. You missed the meeting. This has been well and truly discussed in meetings. I feel totally happy with it. I'm particularly happy with the fact that it is not written in stone, that there's a scope for adjusting depending on wetlands or whatever. So it's not totally binding. There is some latitude there, and that makes me happy about it. So that's why I would recommend it.
Ray.
Are we having a problem with this? I mean, I'm just looking at the examples and everything's falling in under the limits that we would be putting on things. I'm just curious, are we creating rules and regulations for something we don't have a problem for?
Fair question.
I would say it would be helpful to us when we get folks that come back and they're asking about different types of shelters and event centers and parking lots and all that. And we go back and look at the grant agreement, which doesn't specifically speak to that. If we had an impervious surface limit, we could say, yes, that's fine, you're under the cap. I think that combined with the enhanced application, getting more details up front would be helpful for staff.
Jason.
How was, and I understand you have the intergov through the county. So where are the checks and balances for all the other municipalities when you have projects that, over time change, and you may not have any idea that there's actually something happening until that inspection? And I mean, does the Greenbelt have the authority to say, okay, tear it out, or show us what your coverages are? To Ray's point, it gets, we're changing a little bit. It's good to have guidelines and limits perhaps, but
so we do, we monitor each property at least annually. Sometimes we get calls or notified, like through Intergov. If you all are building something, it's still gonna pop up. Well, depends on where you're pulling permits from, but
right.
Assuming you're pulling a permit from anywhere in the county, then we would be notified. And we're gonna have a measuring wheel and start measuring these things and tracking that.
So would the Greenbelt have the authority to then tell someone to tear it out?
I don't think we would have the authority to do that. We would make you all aware of it, and then that would be a non-conforming use. They would be in violation of their grant agreement. So you'd be notified of that, and county council would have the ultimate decision on what the remedy is.
I'm just talking about staffing. I know everybody's got a lot of work to do, and just making sure we're not going down the road of creating undue burden on everybody. I mean, I'm not saying that the city's planning on breaking any rules or anything. I was globally speaking for a dirt program, just making sure that we're still in the spirit.
Fair enough. Christiane and Elizabeth.
Okay, just to offer a comment, I'm glad to see that the non-active and non-corridor projects have been added. I think that makes a big difference here. I do look at this and see the potential for administrative burden. I appreciate where you're coming from, but I think it makes it more complex. I think every project's unique. You're going to have, I think, more often than not, things that don't meet the criteria. It's just projects just you never know what you're getting, and then I get concerned too about what if, for example, there was a piece of property that the town of Mount Pleasant was very interested in recently. We had no plans, but it was one we wanted to move forward with quickly to purchase. And we talked about the potential for Greenbelt property. So what do you do there? It's not been even defined yet whether it's going to be an active or a passive type of use. And I'm not asking you to answer that question. I'm just saying that those are the potential conflicts that I could see with this.
In that scenario, if you're just buying land, a land bank, and you have no clue what you want to do with it, the application does require you to list uses in there. Mm-hmm. So if you're not real clear on those uses, then 10 or 15 years down the road, when you define those, assuming that some would not be included in that original grant agreement, then you would have to come back through the process to have that grant agreement amended.
I just think that staff has done a lot of work on this, and if it will help applicants and staff to know what the expectations are, not that they're cast in stone, but this is about what you can expect to be able to do. I think it's very helpful for especially people who are not municipalities who may be doing this for the first time. I think it's a good thing.
Elizabeth?
That was the point I was going to make.
Okay. All right, if there are not any other comments, I think at this point we would vote. Everybody good? All right, all in favor of the motion, please state with an aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed? I believe it carries unanimously. Thank you. Let's move on to forward spending limits.
All right, this is very similar to the table that we presented last time we discussed forward spending limits. One thing I did catch is that while we intended last time to make that 5%, the column in yellow there, 5% of the remaining balance for the lifetime of each municipality's program, it was actually pulling from the total projected Greenbelt funding from column 1. Which was not the intent. The intent was as that balance goes down, then the amount you're allowed to forward spend would also go down. So this reflects that. And then also new numbers were plugged in with the new revenue estimates. So staff is recommending that 5% of the total balance would be as far as a municipality could, or even the rural area could dip into future earnings. And then Mr. Scarden, I know you and others had expressed some concern that that may not adequately protect urban borrowing from the rural allocation to fund projects. So we'd also talked about a threshold for urban funds to be able to borrow rural funds. And once the rural funding hits a certain limit, based on the information provided, that's somewhere between 3 million or 7 million based on annual allocations and actually what's been approved each year for rural projects over the last few years, that perhaps you would want to pick a number that would be the floor, that rural, once it drops below that or hits that, then there's no borrowing from rural to fund urban projects, to ensure that if there is a large project that comes through in a cycle, large rural project, that the funding's there to actually pay for it. So really haven't changed much on those two slides. And then we'd also discussed that there may be extraordinary projects and that there should be some mechanism to be able to make a recommendation to county council to go beyond perhaps that 5% forward spending limit. And I think what we had discussed was the 2/3 majority may be the right level to put that at. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know you all will probably have some discussion on this.
Yes, Nora.
Can you describe extraordinary projects?
I think those were loosely defined as projects that may be once-in-a-lifetime opportunities that have the opportunity to impact a larger segment of the population. We'd used the term iconic before and talked about Boone Hall and the Angel Oak as some of those projects, projects similar to those. But I wouldn't feel comfortable giving you a specific definition of what extraordinary would mean in this situation.
Mr. Jones.
I don't see real well, but this is probably very simple, but okay, so 5% of the total balance. So the total balance is...
The column on the right, and you also have this printout in front of you.
Okay. So that's what's left. So taking the city of Charleston, so the balance is what they're entitled to over the life of the program. It's not their original, it's what's left after deducting what they've taken, right? So they can draw on $1.6 million for their projects at this time.
So they could actually spend, right now I believe they have $199,000 cash on hand, so they could spend that and then an additional $1.6 million.
Okay, that's fine, I get it.
Yes.
So I've been thinking a lot about this and trying to find ways that could kind of address everyone's concerns and ways to, not over administer, make it too bureaucratic. But a fundamental principle here that I'm concerned about, just kind of passing up a policy that allows a blanket 5% forward spending, is that we're implying that we allow on any occasion the allocation to be overspent, to forward spend. And I think that's very risky from a fiscal responsibility point of view. I know that other entities, public bodies who spend tax dollars, you've got to spend the dollars at hand. If we need to bond and borrow, then we need to consider that. There are ways to do that. By just including 5% without putting in the context of fiscal responsibility, I think that's a risky maneuver, and that's something I could not support. I don't think that's fiscally responsible for us as a Greenbelt. I do see the times that we may need, in unusual circumstances, someone to forward spend without putting other dollars at risk or jeopardizing other allocations. We've all agreed on allocations, and each entity, municipalities, and then the rural bucket have a very specific amount they get each time. I think that we should affirm that that's how the application should be, so that if someone's applying for dollars in an application cycle, they're aware of how much money they can be competitive for. And they apply for that. That by having that expectation, we encourage financial partnerships for them to go and seek money elsewhere. Sometimes folks just try to get as much as they can from us and don't really put an effort into leveraging that. I think we want to encourage that because those funds are often there and many times haven't been sought when the application comes. I'd like to make sure that what we approve in this encourages that kind of partnership. So the language needs to do that. We also want to make sure that we protect other funds, that there is no rating of other funds, and that because someone has the ability to apply for more and bigger projects, that they are using up funds that should be available for others. And we've talked, a lot about that. I think one thing, and I've actually spent some time trying to draft a sample motion just to kind of try and help us not waste so much time on wordsmithing, that includes a couple of these points. And they're all, obviously, I put them out there for y'all to discuss. Okay, and yeah, we'll pass those. Peggy will pass that around. But basically what the principles that are in here is that in order for a project to seek a 5% forward spend, is that the project needs to be a good project. It needs to score well. The second point is that forward spending request does not exceed 5%. It puts in this 5% cap in there of the total Greenbelt funds that are remaining in the life of the program. The third is that the applicant has actually sought funding from other sources, and those exist. I do want to be clear that, and the city has done this before as a good example, of actually seeking bridge funding for a project that they didn't have sufficient Greenbelt funds for. They actually applied for bridge funding from the Conservation Fund. Fortunately, we're in this county, we have access to the Community Loan Fund, which is a part of the Coastal Community Foundation, and they exist exactly for the purpose of doing short-term bridge loans to help conservation projects, organizations be able to protect parcels. The Greenbelt would fit into that perfectly. The fourth is that the forward spending funding would not adversely impact the availability of current funds for other allocations. So that means that in this cycle, if those funds are not being used, they could apply to have a 5% forward spend, and if they're not being needed in that cycle, that's okay. But if they aren't available, then that 5% is not available that cycle, and that's a cash flow issue of funds available for this cycle. And then the last point is that the overall allocations of the established by the Greenbelt program will not be affected, but municipalities are able to designate funds from their own allocations to be used in partnership with other applications of the Greenbelt. And we've seen good examples of that, with the city doing that most recently at Oakville. Mount Pleasant did that for Boone Hall. I want to encourage that and have that as something that we would like to see, those kind of partnerships go forward. And then lastly, there's the caveat here on over 5%, and I think, Nora, this is what you were talking about, kind of these iconic projects that you would say only in extraordinary circumstances should an applicant seek funding in excess of the 5% cap. Such projects are rare, but they do exist. Approval to apply for funding for such iconic projects will require a supermajority vote of the GAB and the county council, and we can agree on what that is, whether it's 71% of the GAB, and I'm not sure exactly what that breaks down to county council. But this is what I felt kind of met the needs that I'm thinking about, and I'm hearing people speaking about. I'm sure there's differences of opinion, but that's a starting point, and I would be happy to introduce that as a motion if people want that or if they want more discussion.
Jason first, and then Mr. Jones.
Do we have to have a motion in order to open up discussion, or
Not now.
not yet?
That's typically for projects, but we now have a motion on the table.
I haven't made the
you haven't made
no,
it?
I have. That's
Okay.
what I'm saying. I have
Okay.
not made that motion for this reason, so there could be discussion on
Gotcha.
this and not
Sorry.
have it so constricted. I do think we want that flow of different views here.
Maybe Mark can chime in, but my thought is this 5-year plan review is almost like a workshop.
Yes.
That we're able to talk through these things prior to any motion. But Mr. Bell?
Mr. Scarden, to clarify your question, and typically when projects come forward, we do like to have motions and seconds prior to discussion. As the Greenbelt Director had says, this is an unusual circumstance where, hey, this is just a workshop where you guys are discussing what your plan is. Right now, it is a presentation to you. You guys are allowed to ask questions and talk about the presentation at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you. Jason, then Mr. Jones.
So, this is a big one, right? Especially with the fact that, per Elizabeth's comments, that the city allocated money for from the urban allocation to a conservation easement recently. So that's a little bit complicated in then how you measure percentages. I think I wouldn't be comfortable of voting on anything like this until I had the ability to bring this in front of the mayor and city council. And so I would just respectfully request that if this is the motion, I couldn't vote on anything, and respectfully request a deferment if we are going to vote on something until either a committee of city council had the ability to review this, or the mayor gives his input as well. So thank you.
Okay. Mr. Jones?
I think in the beginning of the presentation, we talked about the purpose of it, the protection. In my view, one of the things, perhaps the most important thing, what we're talking about protects Mount Pleasant and North Charleston from not having funds available when they have a project. Having the 5% limit sort of provides a certain degree or a lot of protection. Secondly, the motion by Mr. Haygood is interesting, but I really don't think it's much different from what's before us. We're having a 5% limit, which is here, and anything above that needs a supermajority. I mean, we have all of this verbiage, but doesn't that virtually say the same thing as what we're looking at?
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, it does in terms of the actual specifics. What I felt was really important is that we aren't actually changing. If we don't put this in there, then we are subscribing to 5% forward spending on pretty much any application that comes through. And I don't feel like that's the intent of what we're looking at. This is saying that the expectation is the applicant is going to apply within the funding limit that's available for that cycle. If they need more and have pursued other financial options, then we would consider this. They could apply for up to 5% more. But without this, you're allowing any and everybody to just automatically tack 5% on without accountability for pursuing alternative funding, without really considering, and those are things that we established in the criteria for the Greenbelt funding earlier.
Elizabeth, thank you for all the thought on this. I think it's great. Eric, have we bumped up against this? Well, the 5% is roughly based on 1 year of inflow, cash inflow, correct? Per allocation.
It's a little less now.
A little less
1
now.
year with the new revenue projections.
And we're 5 years into this program, basically, for a little over 4 years into this. And other than the extraordinary projects, have there been examples where we've substantially gone over the 5%?
I'm sure there are.
Oh, you're sure there are? Okay.
Yeah, let's see.
You're sure there are too?
I've looked at it.
Okay.
We have done that.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we have done that. But to date, it hasn't created any burden on anyone else to this point.
To my knowledge, we haven't reached a point to where someone has forward spent and there's been another project that we were not able to fund because someone has forward spent. Now, Mount Pleasant, City of North Charleston, they're sitting on a pretty good chunk of change. So if they called that in, then I believe that would change things significantly.
Okay. All right, I just wanted to try to clarify some of that.
So I guess similar to what you were saying, currently, because this cap is not in place, essentially it would be the subcommittee and then the full GAB's decision whether to allow someone to forward spend or not, right? That would be the current way that we would administer that.
That is how it's currently done. Yeah.
So because of we're talking about adding this extraordinary circumstance, isn't that the same thing that we're currently doing?
Elizabeth, you want to speak?
Yeah, the reason that I see it a little bit, I think it is by de facto. What we're trying to do is help staff here again also and the applicants be very clear on the expectation. I think we're going to bump up, as Beezer pointed out, against conflicting uses as we use up more of the overall Greenbelt funds as we go down the line. And we are doing this now, but my experience in looking at every one of these applications on the subcommittee and really scrutinizing them is that unless we as an individual body ask the specific question and raise it, then it doesn't get attention. And I think it's important enough that we need to have a policy on it so that everyone understands it and it's not ad hoc. that we aren't, and for consistency, so we're treating everyone fairly, that everyone has the same access to the same situation as others. Otherwise, you're just responding to what the applicants in that pool are doing. Your sphere of context is just that pool, and it's very hard, I think, for us longitudinally to be aware of everything we have done and haven't done in the past. This is a question of fair application and consideration for everyone.
Francis?
I wanted to hear what North Charleston and Mount Pleasant thought about it. If they were concerned about Charleston's forward spending, does it make it easier for you to have that option? Or are you concerned, or just your viewpoint?
I don't know that we are, the town of Mount Pleasant is overly concerned, and I think for a couple of reasons. I think that, we recognize that we've probably got some options to kind of leverage our own funds in certain ways. And honestly, right now, our primary goal is Mount Pleasant Way, and those are going to kind of come in little smaller increment kind of projects. I mean, yeah, every now and then, like I was mentioning a while ago, we had something that could have been a once-in-a-lifetime project, didn't quite pan out. But we would have looked for an opportunity to probably maybe forward spend, leverage some of this money. But overall, I think we're pretty comfortable with it as is right now.
What about you, Ray? You want to speak to it?
Well, Francis, just like everything else, you don't know when projects are going to come along. And, I always said, as long as this fund's there, I'd hate to see us be able to lose a project if the funds aren't there. And then that falls back really on the county council then to make some decisions in terms of that. Will they advance the money for a project that needs to be accomplished in terms of that? We are working on a couple that's going to come through that's going to bring our balance down fairly substantial over this next cycle or two to accommodate those things. These have just taken time to get to that point. I kind of go back to the discussion on the last item. Do we really have a problem? I just think we always have to recognize what we're doing and making sure we're trying to be fair to everybody, because the way the allocations were set up, we already have parameters and rules on how the allocations were set up, and we want to make sure we have those availability. I'd hate to see one group or the other just totally decimate all the funds and you're stuck until 10 years out to get the dollars. And certainly we don't know what's going to happen from any time. Eric said we had a good year this year and the allocation actually bumped up, but remember there's also a cap on the dollar amount as well as the duration of the years. And it behooves us all to try to get as many things as we can done as early as we can, because prices of land continue to go up. The decision was made early on that we're not going to bond this, so it's a pay-as-you-go. It's just we as a group have to be cognizant of what we're recommending forward to county council to do. And I know there's been some discussions about up and spending. Charleston was very fortunate to get a couple of projects out early. That's the way I looked at it. They were able to get to the table a little bit earlier, and they ended the allocation a little bit. So far, we haven't had a problem. I don't know if we're going to get to that point. I hope we don't. I don't know where the available lands are all over the county. I know ours is, like Mount Pleasant, is getting a little bit limited. We're working on a 700-acre project right now, and that may be the largest we'll be able to pull together unless we continue to do some annexations or things of that nature. So I'm just thinking about where we are and then what's going to be there. So not panicked yet, but cautious, and just make sure we treat each other fairly in this group.
Barbara?
I think Elizabeth's motion is really very well thought out and good. I think it's a reminder. It can serve as a reminder to us that first you spend the money that has been allocated, and only in very unusual circumstances do we dip into forward spending. And I think it's also good for the applicant to know that they're limited, at least at first blush, to the amount that's been allocated. The only thing that I would want to add to the motion would be what scoring well, what does that actually mean? Like, what is the range? At least X or whatever. I think to outline everything as much as possible is a good thing.
Yeah, Mr. Jones and then Nora.
Okay, this is my suggestion. We scrap the 5% limit, we go back to the limits, but then we allow for an extra allocation if it's approved by the committee on extraordinary circumstances which requires a supermajority. That makes it very simple. We don't automatically have people coming for the 5%, but we have an option there for people to go beyond the 5% if they can prove that it's emeritus or it's worthy of consideration for extra funding.
Okay, Nora? Or does anybody want to comment on that, or Nora's next?
I like that.
I like that too.
Well,
Okay, will you say it again, Mr. Jones?
Oh, you're taxing me. That we leave the situation as it is at the moment and the allocations and whatever. And that's what you apply for if it's there. If you think that the project has particular merit, then you go before the committee and say, I think this has got particular merit and that we want an allocation beyond what we're legally allowed. And the subcommittee decides that on the merit. I don't want to put a limit on that, I don't know, but then the subcommittee has to come before the Greenbelt Advisory Board and make its case and ask to determine with a supermajority. How's that?
Did everybody hear that, and is that clear?
I'd like to hear Elizabeth's response to that.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that's what this does, except this says you can't go over 5%. Because I think what we're doing is we get further down the life cycle of the of this project, we are going to have more conflicting uses. It's going to be tighter as the funds get smaller. And that's why the 5% cap was even, I think, suggested, was so that we wouldn't get over our skis with responding to individual exceptions, that there would be some kind of game in place for fairness. I think the intent of this, and I like what you're saying, Warwick, is that you apply for the funds at hand. This is pay as you go, that you have to make a request for something exceptional. But the limit is 5%, except in this very extraordinary circumstance, which you would require county council ultimate supermajority as well as Greenbelt. But I don't see that much difference except for the fact that we have a 5% limit in what you could ask for, and that's really to level the playing field for everyone.
Okay, Nora was next. I don't know if you have a comment on this topic.
I have a question.
Okay, well, then we'll finish this thought.
Wait, I have a question for Eric.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Eric, you discussed borrowing from rural funds. Could you describe the process of what happens after someone borrows from rural funds?
I may have not stated that correctly. Basically, there's one pot of cash. So whenever a project would get approved, that would be an urban project, we don't have two accounts. We're just looking to that one pot of cash. The cash flow, the way it's been done up to this point, to my knowledge, is that if the cash flow has been there, whether it's rural or urban, and it's gotten approved, then we funded that project. But there's technically not two separate accounts to where there's not an urban and a rural account. Now, there are allocations, but as Mr. Guile, when he spoke, I think back in November, his guidance was that we're only bound by the cash that's on hand. So if you've got 10 million in requests and we've only got 9 million total in cash on hand between urban and rural allocations, then you got to cut $1 million from it somewhere. I don't think that exactly answered your question. I'm not really sure what the process would be that you're referring to.
Yeah, 'cause you mentioned borrowing from rural earlier on, and so I was confused.
Yeah.
Okay.
So once the urban allocation, urban requests would exceed the urban allocation, then you would technically be borrowing from rural's allocation.
We got a question on that.
Well, Jason, then Elizabeth, but if it's a question on that, go ahead.
Well, just to Elizabeth, okay, so how does this affect the rural funds? Are you saying the county may only look at it as one pot, but I think we as a committee look at it as different allocations, and that's what we strive to live by. You're right, we can go and take from the rural. I guess for Elizabeth, did you consider the impact are there any protections for the rural funds?
Yes.
With your,
The intent is to make sure that we've had the luxury of being able to have that not impact the permanent long-term allocation between rural and urban. We've been able to use the cash flow because there have been some unused rural funds that could fund forward spending, knowing that they'd catch up. This is a perfect example now. We're caught up, pretty much except for the urban unincorporated, which is very low funding to begin with. But I do think that we've talked a lot about that, and I agree that you would never want to forward spend to get to that point that you have compromised or changed the overall allocation of rural to urban. In other words, you can't raid the rural funds for urban projects or the other way around. Let's just say suddenly rural became big. It's fair. It's not one against the other, but that you honor the intent that we've said that these are the percentages for all. And then within the urban buckets, they're broken into sub-buckets. So you don't want to take from Lincolnville, even though it's a very, very small pot. It takes them a long time to use that. You wouldn't want to raid that. So I think implied in here is that forward spending does not adversely impact the availability of those funds for any of the allocations. That you can't raid buckets is what I'm talking about, is the intent.
yeah. I think I'd like to see a little bit more specific
think
about
that's a
the
good
urban
suggestion.
and the rural. And, you know, I don't want to strap us, if we do get that extraordinary project, to say, boy, if we only could take $1 million out of the rural funds, and the rural sitting there with $20 million with no projects. That's why I'd like to see the floor, and you know, the process would be you use your own funds, your own allocation, then you go to and I'm just thinking if it's an urban project, you use all the urban funds available so that, I mean, you're only spending what you have on hand, and if you need some more money, I think you could dip into the rural, but I'd want to make sure that we're protected. So if we do have projects that have, you know, these folks work very hard to get them, and it just takes longer when you're working with landowners for these smaller groups. I don't want all of a sudden they finally get there and it's a time-sensitive project and we say, sorry, you know, we bought something bigger.
I think we should clarify Sullivan's and Folly and Isle Palms relative to this, but Jason had something, he was up next.
Yeah, I wanted to say that we've always been encouraged to apply for a project from Greenbelt staff from the single pot of money if we thought it was an important project. For the city to bring a project through, there's a lot of steps that we have to go through. So I just need to make sure before I could support a motion or a vote that I report this out to our real estate committee of city council.
Thank you. I believe Mr. Jones was next.
I just want to say, I think we're getting ahead. I think this was this division between rural and not rural was something else along the line. But if that's being discussed now, I would be very uneasy about mingling the funds from rural and non-rural, full stop.
Okay, thanks. Elizabeth?
So if we want to pursue, the goal is to actually come up with something that we can approve. If Jason says he needs to get some guidance in order to do that, perhaps we could work to improve this with the things that have been suggested. And I think Barbara's point about what's a good score is really important, and that gets to something that we talked about earlier, and maybe in this timing we could do, is actually going back and looking. We talked about this when we set up the scoring process in the beginning. Looking back and deciding what have we approved, what were the actual numbers, under what circumstance, because we know that, you know, some of these beach access, they get lower scores. You can't compare that lower score with the other scores. Maybe we could actually analyze the numbers and come up with what we talked about, you know, good, better, best, not good. and understanding and being able to put some score ranges in here if that would be helpful, and consider that.
We can certainly put that together for, each type of project. Here's all the scores that have been approved. Here's the lowest, here's the highest, and then here's the average.
Right. And we can all talk about it.
Ray, then Mr. Jones.
Just a couple of points, and I agree with Jason, because the 3 municipalities report to other people, and we need to have a little time to talk this over. But specifically to the motion, 90% of the time I see a supermajority at 66 2/3%, and I do think that needs to be adjusted. And my recommendation, take out any reference to county council. County council has their own rules of how they govern it and what they deal with how they deal with their function. I don't know that it's this body's responsibility to make recommendations to say how they govern their rules in their scenario. They have their own thing, whether it's a simple majority or if it's a supermajority, and certainly the county attorney can address that better. But I'm not sure this falls to that, and I just think that we'd just be, I don't want to say sending an insult, but I just know that we should be addressing that.
That's a good comment. Thank you. Mr. Jones?
I just think there's so many things here. I still think simplicity is the best. The supermajority is something I thought we were going to discuss later today. But then again, we still have this issue of the 5%. Do we look to it, or do we ignore it? I mean, we seem to just walking over it at this stage. We haven't seemed to have reached a conclusion.
Well, that is the recommendation of staff, and that is kind of it seems like the heart of this motion also. But real quick, let's just clear up the smaller municipalities. Like, they almost have to forward spend, so how do we address that? And if that's already been stated, forgive me, but can we hear it one more time? Like, if Isle of Palms was another boardwalk for $100,000, how would they do that under this, either the motion or your recommendation?
Oh, they have 191 in their account, so.
Oh, excuse me. Okay, let me pick somebody who doesn't have quite that much. Hold on.
Lincolnville's got 85.
Lincolnville.
Okay, Lincolnville. If
Or Sullivan's, because they've already spent, they're the lowest.
Well,
But they knew that. But Lincolnville hasn't spent, and they're at 85.
pick any one of them who currently does not have enough money, and they have a project that far exceeds 5%. A small municipality, could they? They just have to go for a special exception, and that's it. Just that's part of the application, and they know up front that they can do that if they need to.
Fall under that extraordinary
right.
project with the 2/3 supermajority from this board.
I think that's, as long as we're not excluding someone like Lincolnville just they go read the boilerplate and just don't apply. Like, that would be too bad. Right? So I would seek to avoid that. Just, we don't want to weed anybody out of this process. I don't, just through the language.
But what this is saying, the way I see it, just kind of applying that Lincolnville, if that came in and this were in place, then they would make their special exception request, and we would look at we'd see what's the cash flow, what's the funds available now. If it was hitting up on any ceiling or impacting any other allocation or compromising other funding of other ones, then we would look at that.
Right. And for Lincolnville to forward spend more than 5%, it's still going to be a teeny tiny
Pretty
amount.
small.
As long as we don't weed
so
them out
that
up front.
that impact
Yeah.
may not be as big as if
That'd be an easier one to deal with.
the city of Charleston forward
Right.
spending 5%.
That burden element
Yeah.
that Ray mentioned, as long as we're not putting unnecessary burden on the applicant, and it simultaneously helps you guys, which is really part of the goal here.
Yeah. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I think
Yeah.
we've gotten a lot of good feedback, and I know that municipalities need to go and talk to their real estate committees and mayors and all of that stuff. I can reach out to you between now and the next time we meet to discuss this to try and tighten up that recommendation and that motion.
Sounds good.
For further discussion.
That sounds really good. So we're gonna table this one for today, and we're gonna go to the next topic. Right? Public support of scoring criteria.
Last time we discussed this, got just a little bit of feedback. The intent is to incentivize applicants to reach out to their nearby community and make sure this is a project that is being supported. So we recommended some changes to our public support scoring criteria that's currently in the application, which is this: 6 points, 3 points for letters or emails from the public, 2 points for results of a public hearing, and other, 1 point, which I haven't seen. I don't think I've seen an application yet to get points for other, because that's not really defined, and I don't know what other would be.
Your mother.
So we made some recommendations last time to reorganize this. So 3 points would be support letters or emails from individuals and grassroots organizations. Last time we said in the immediate project area, but there was some concern over that because that project, how do you define that immediate project area? And it could have a wider impact than just the municipality it's located in. I think I haven't seen a public hearing yet for one of these projects. I don't think anybody's really doing that. There are public meetings, and then we've had folks provide survey results that support projects. So I felt like you could get up to 2 points for favorable results from a public meeting or survey. If 90% oppose it, then you wouldn't get those points because those wouldn't be favorable results. And then lastly, support letters and emails from regional and national advocacy organizations. That's the bulk of what we get in there. As you all know, they're kind of form letters that the different nonprofits kind of support each other's projects and municipal projects and share between them. So you can pretty much count on those with every single application. So just trying to rearrange this to encourage a little bit more true evidence of local grassroots support for the project.
Elizabeth?
So just to kind of clarify that, because I think this is a good thing to do. We've seen that this is needed, that clarification. I also think we've also seen people claim points that they didn't have proof that they actually had support. And so we've actually seen applications state support from folks that hadn't given it. So will you actually ask for, proof of that?
Well, we only award points now when we receive the actual letters from those organizations or individuals.
Yeah, I'm saying this.
Yeah, we don't just take the applicant's word for it.
Yeah, because some of the applicants have done that, and good. Okay.
If they're forging letters,
no, they didn't forge the letter, but they actually said certain groups had supported them when they hadn't.
Gotcha.
Yes, Taylor.
How do you define the public meeting or survey? Do they have to describe that to give us I can see having a bunch of people over that I know support the program, and we all say yes, and there you go.
I think they provide details on what type of meeting that was,
how it's advertised,
how many attended, how it was advertised. Same with the survey. We would want to see those survey results, because just because you do a survey doesn't necessarily mean you're getting results that are in favor of the project. So I think ultimately it's up to us as staff, and we score it to, use some common sense and say this looks valid, and we're going to award those points, and the same for the subcommittee.
Any other, Mr. Jones?
I'm going to be a Philistine and say I'm not happy about this at all. I guess I voted for it originally, but I guess from my experience and observation, the public support is sort of a fickle thing. Just to give an example, and you've alluded to it, the extension of 526. If you came to some of the meetings here, you would have overwhelming opposition to the extension of 526. But then Joe Quayle, he voted to stop the extension, and he lost his seat, assuming because the majority of the people in his electorate were for the extension. So measuring this support is something else. And again, I think of Harbourview Road. That was the money spent there. It seemed that the community changed its mind after $1 million was spent. And the first survey, it was favourable, then it was not favourable. So I'm saying measuring public support is difficult. Again, you've alluded to it. You have certain organisations who are very well organised, who can probably organise the hundreds of letters to come in for a particular project. But it's only because again, I'll draw an example or mention names. The Conservation League, which generally does a very good job, has a lot of very committed members who swear by conservation. So you wave the flag of conservation and they come and vote, almost without considering perhaps the merits. So I'm just wary. And I would say also, Planning Commission, Greenbelt Advisory Board, is supposed to be able to gain the merit of a particular project beyond what the public says. I guess I'll just rest my case there. I feel unhappy about it, but that's it.
Christiane.
I have a couple of questions or comments. First of all, with the public meeting, I think it's very easy for the municipalities to do that. We do it with everything. I don't know how some of these other groups can really do that. So they're kind of missing out on those points with it. And then when it comes to any of this, the only people who show up at the public meetings are usually people who are opposed. I mean, that's, or the people that have concerns and questions. That's just the nature of it. That's where you get the emails or whatever. And so I don't know. I've got some concerns with it. But anyway, that's it.
Any recommended changes?
No, well, I do think you need. This doesn't benefit, a municipality anyway. But I do think something needs to be done about the fact that I think other entities that aren't perhaps a city don't really have the ability to have the public meetings the same. So I think that there probably should be some sort of consideration there with it. And I don't know what the answer is. It's like I said, it's usually the naysayers that are going to show up at a public meeting. That's just the nature of what it is. If you're happy, you don't say anything. And so I don't know how you necessarily address that there. I am glad to see that you did make some modifications so it's not exclusive to the area. I of course, have Mount Pleasant Way on my mind with this, and that's intended to be a town-wide project, and to to not allow the letters of support from individuals that live in different areas of the town, I think is to allow letters, I guess, from individuals from other area of the town is beneficial for projects like this. I don't really know the answer. Maybe I could think about it more. But anyway, I've just got some concerns with just, been doing planning for a long time. And so I know how the naysayers typically show up.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think I hear what you're saying, Christiane, and I think this is an imperfect component. I also think that some way to gauge public support is critical. We talked about this when we were establishing the criteria, is that it's very hard to get it just right. I think your tweaks to it have improved it to make it more reflective of there. It's never going to be right, but I think that particularly for projects that the public likes, that are received a lot of public support. I'm just going to call like the Angel Oak and in Boone Hall. You need to be able to show that somewhere in the application, in the criteria that's objective. I don't think it's always going to be right. That's why it's just 1 point for the other ones. But I think if we didn't have it in there, we would be missing an important component of our criteria. And I also can imagine that this is going to be needed when we have to deal with future requests for changes, that we need to understand what the public really thinks about something, and having the ability to scrutinize, is this really accurately reflecting what the public's doing, or is it just a bunch of naysayers who came out? We need to be able to look at that information and assess it. Without anything in there, I don't know how we do that other than our personal opinions.
I have a question.
Barbara.
How many points do approved projects usually have? I'm wondering how important 6 points is in the scheme of things.
Well, again,
Depends on how
they
close.
range. It depends on the type of project, whether it's, minor improvement only. The corridor projects don't typically score well because the application's not set up for that type of scoring. So we are going to work on giving you here's a top score and here's a bottom score for projects approved that are minor improvement projects, and here's the average. So that is some information we'll bring back to you.
Well, how many points did Angel Oak and Boone Hall garner, for instance? They're
No clue.
extraordinary.
Boone Hall
extraordinary.
got 91, if I recall, and I think that's the highest scoring project we've had that ever. Most of them that get approved are from 70s and up. I'm just calling ballpark. This is,
Yeah.
when we look at the numbers, you'll give them to us. But I think what we realize is it's impossible to get 100 on this. I mean, there's no perfect, the way it's set up is that's not the true ideal. But I do think we want to be able to know that 6 points makes a difference whether you are, I think particularly for projects that aren't just outstanding but are good, that can make a difference on that.
I think it would be very bad policy not to have any points allowed for public input.
I agree.
Taylor.
As we go through this, I'm wondering, are we asking or looking at the right areas? For example, for the folks who do this, the municipalities, I know you have to send out a notification to the neighboring property owners, but I don't know if we ever get, unless somebody feels compelled to write the Greenbelt, we don't really know what that response is. I don't think it's part of the application, is it? So that's something I'd like to know. Is there, are you doing something that everybody, at least the surrounding area, doesn't like for any projects, not just municipality? I'm asking you because y'all are sort of do these and could probably give me an answer on that since the other folks aren't here.
Well, so we do these public meetings, and we send out as much notification as we can to the people typically in the area. I mean, it's announced townwide, but we will focus on the particular area wherever the project is. We will solicit letters. Now, it's easier to solicit the letters from those regional and national advocacy
Right,
groups,
yeah.
and then sometimes some of the grassroots groups.
But
don't you have to send out a letter to the...
All applications are required to send out an adjacent landowner notification. Any parcel within 300 feet of the border of the subject parcel gets one of those letters, just notifying them that they are applying for Greenbelt funds for this to acquire this land.
And is there anywhere that says email the Greenbelt director if with your comments or something like that?
I don't think so.
We collect what we receive back, and we put it back within our submittal.
Right.
We could easily add an email address to provide comments. That's
Well, in the
something you all
spirit
would
of
like to
time, we
see.
have a recommendation from the staff. Does anybody want to see that move forward, changed, rejected?
Is that the whole thing, or is there more? That's
That's
everything.
it.
Pretty much the whole thing.
I guess I'd like to just see a little bit more specificity on the second bullet there. Just no more information.
Cool with you to, we have one, I guess that would have to be a motion, Taylor, I suppose. I don't know. No, okay. So we have a request for more information or more detail on bullet number 2.
Is everybody ready to vote on this and approval? Then I'd probably.
I have a comment.
Yes.
I think what Taylor said, in order to, you could add on their results, send it to your email. Would that be too much for staff?
No, ma'am. On the landowner notification letters.
Yeah, and then.
Yeah, we can. I need to look at that letter and see exactly what it says, but we can certainly add that, without any motion by the GAB.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be great.
I think the goal of this is is to try and kind of tick off some things. If this is something that we feel like we can vote on and approve today, then we can do that and make a motion. But if there's an impediment, like on the last one, then we have got specifics so that next time we can vote. That's good. Is there something, I'm prepared to vote on this one today, but I'm putting that to the rest of y'all.
Well, I think we can vote on it with him just adding
Absolutely.
the email.
That wouldn't,
Then we need a motion.
I'll make that motion
Okay.
to approve it as recommended.
Well,
And
Let's-
I'll second it with adding the email.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so now discussion, Mr. Jones.
Okay, in principle, I support it, but it's the application, support letters from individuals. Honestly, you're talking about 100 acres, which is going to be put under a conservation easement. How many letters would you get in the support? 1, 2, 3? I don't know.
Usually 0.
Okay, so how can you allocate any points on something?
They don't get points for that.
Okay, well, then that's my point, I guess. It's the application by the subcommittee as to how they consider support. That's what I'm concerned about. If I can't argue about Boone Hall, that's 100% correct. I would give it 100 too. But it's the other ones that I think that maybe, or I suspect, and maybe not rightly, that they get support or 3 points when they've not deserved. That's my issue. But anyhow, I will vote for it.
Okay. All right, then. We have a motion, we have a second, we have a slight adjustment to the bullet point number 2. Unless there are any more comments, we'll now vote. All in favor, please state with an aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Great. The motion carries by unanimous support. Thank you. Now, Eric, a recap of resolved issues and an overview of remaining topics.
This is just briefly to remind everybody where we are and kind of what we have to cover before the end of the year. Under our resolved column, we've got borrowing. We decided that at January of every year, we're going to look at all the information to see if it makes sense to borrow each year. Structures and improvements, I think that is being addressed with impervious surfaces as well as improvements to the applications to gather more information upfront on those improvement changes after approval. We do have a process for that. And again, I think with the new applications, having more information on exactly what those improvements are, that'll help address this issue. Deadlines for improvements in public access, we talked about that last time, and as I understand it, we said each project is so unique that we couldn't really put a standard across the board. You must be finished with all public access improvements within 5 years or 10 years or whatever, that those would be treated on a case-by-case basis with special conditions. Impervious surfaces can now be moved over to that category, which leaves forward spending. Public input criteria is moved over to the resolved category, but transfers and conversion procedures, non-compliance, and enforcement are things that we've introduced to you and discussed, but we haven't quite resolved yet. Not introduced yet, so still to go are corridor projects and how those may need to be looked at differently, specifically in the application. And I'll be working with the town of Mount Pleasant on that over the summer as we get further into their first corridor project. Stormwater infrastructure, we talked about, or Elizabeth had mentioned, engineered systems versus natural systems, and how we may want to look at those in the application when it talks about infrastructure for stormwater mitigation. And then the last two items, the small landowner program has about $80,000 left balance in there. And as we know, urban unincorporated is forward spent considerably with only 30% of the funding remaining in that account. There were some comments that we may want to look at those and determine if we should make a recommendation to council to add additional funds to those pots. I think getting the impervious surfaces completed and hopefully the forward spending next time we meet, to me, those are the two biggest, most complex issues. So I do feel like we're on schedule to finish this up by the end of the year, knowing that we may not meet in July and August based on the feedback that we've gotten from my email asking about availability.
Yeah, that sounds good. Jason, you have a comment?
Quick question on you mentioned on deadlines for improvements in public access. You said it was going to be a case by case.
Yeah, Elizabeth had wanted to discuss that, and it must have been that February GAB meeting where we had talked about, is there a way to put in a standard like our impervious surface caps or something like that to all projects to say, if you're saying you're going to have public access or you're going to build these park features, then you must have them completed within 5 years of the grant agreement or 10 years. And as I recall, that discussion basically said that each project is so different. And then you've also got, Charleston County Parks bought land for the next 30 years. So we know that's not going to be done in 5 or 10 years, that you really couldn't put a standard in place, that if you had concerns about somebody's ability to open up those public access facilities, and especially whenever they're using those as match, right? Their construction match, because then that gives them more points on the application. Then you may want to start looking closer at a special condition to require those to be implemented by a certain time.
Any other questions on this topic status? Okay. All right, so it's time for our nomination and election of officers. We have 2 officer positions, chair and vice chair. I'd like to say I'm very proud of the work we've accomplished during my tenure as chair, and I'd be happy to continue. However, I understand if others feel differently, and if any of you are interested in assuming a more formal leadership role, by all means, step forward. And absolutely no hard feelings or ill will if that's the case. I think we all want what's best for the GAB, and seriously, if anybody wants to do this role or vice chair, by all means, now is your chance. While perhaps awkward, this would be a time to do it. Or I'm also very happy to continue in this role. Elizabeth is currently vice chair. How do you?
I'll do the same. If there's somebody who feels called, please raise your hand.
That's right.
I'll put you out your misery. I nominate that the chairman and the vice chairman remain the same.
Okay. All right. Well, that's very nice. What's that? Okay. All right.
All for the vote?
All for the vote. Yeah. So so we currently have a motion to basically stay the course. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. All opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. It's very nice. And I do care how these meetings go. And so if anybody has feedback on how to improve the meetings, we have a lot of things to think about here, but I really am serious about trying to keep these meetings moving, professional, and observing all the correct rules. So if any of y'all ever have a comment, I really do welcome that. Our next meeting is June 8th. And unless you have any other business.
I've heard from most everybody whether they're able to attend the summer meetings or not. There were a few that were not sure yet. So if you didn't respond, please let me know just so we can ensure we've got a quorum. As I understand it, summer's sometimes difficult to get a GAB quorum. So just trying to plan ahead for that 5-year review. And I do anticipate a fairly time-sensitive topic may be coming before you in June. So it would be really great if we could meet in June, if we're taking July and August off.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. So, what we could do.
It's good seeing you, Barbara.
Same here.
Good comment.
They're going to not have us.